Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Tigest Wako Natural Processed Ethiopia from Monogram Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Monogram, based out of Calgary, Alberta. And for the third time, they were a suggestion to us by One Man's Chorus. So for the third time, a shout out to and thank you to One Man's Chorus for the suggestion. This is part 3 of our 3-part series featuring Monogram and their third ever appearance on this channel. And typically when featuring a roaster for the first time, we like to review one of their washed and one of their non-washed offerings, with this coffee counting as Monogram's non-washed representative. So we will see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 35. And recipe we went with for this coffee was once again Monogram's recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one, even though it's typically a little bit more tricky to tell when it comes to more heavily processed coffees, this one right here definitely was in line with our previous experiences with Monogram's coffees, which is to say that it's on the more developed side of the medium light in terms of that roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and the first try we opted for was with the Chemex, and could immediately tell that this probably wasn't the ideal brew method for this coffee, as it seems to accentuate a lot of the more notable fermenty berry characteristics to it, with a focus on the listed strawberry attribute, as well as a slight bit of some chocolate, and the listed peach also feeling a little bit fermenty. So not necessarily the best and most ideal first impression. But we continue on to day 16, opted for the V60, and actually had pretty similar results, as it continued to remain on the heavier and fermenty side of things, with more of a focus on the berries yet again. Strong focus on that listed strawberry attribute with a slight graining quality as well. So just an okay second day as well. We continue on to day 18 and opted for the April brewer, as the struggles continued with slightly less fermentiness within the cup itself. However, a lot of the more roasty and smoky aspects were notable this time around, as it did have more of the peachiness in higher definition, as well as plenty of the berry characteristics to it. So kind of a mixed bag on this third day, but even then haven't necessarily achieved the best within this coffee yet. Day 20, back through the Chemex with Monogram's recipe, and this is the best day of the coffee we had had up to this point, as the lowering of the temperatures really did seem to help with a lot of the heaviness within this one. The vibrant fruit aspects were a little bit more clear and defined, as the listed strawberry was the most notable thing yet again. This time it was a little bit more defined, given that there was a little less of that fermenty and heavy aspect that was kind of overbearing the cup. Day 23, through the V60 with Monogram's recipe, and this is the best day we've had up to this point, as it continues to offer more of the defined berry attributes in a slightly more clean manner relative to some of our earlier experiences. The coffee has been on the mostly consistent side of things, as the development continues to play a significant role in this cup, with a fair bit of these smoky qualities still continuing to remain ever present. Day 25, back through the Chemex, and it's at this moment I decided to stick with the V60 going forward, as the Chemex really did seem to accentuate some more of the smoky qualities within the coffee, as well as the berry feeling a little bit more faint and diluted. And given that I was trying to maybe counteract those things by reducing the smokiness, reducing the heaviness and the fermentiness, and kind of dialing up the strawberry as well as peach attributes to it, wasn't necessarily ideal in that sense. A slight heavy chocolate with more of the stone fruit brightness present in the finish. Day 28, another try through the V60, and it's at this moment that this coffee has mostly reached a point of consistency, as it continues to offer a slightly heavier cup in general, while providing plenty of the fruit vibrancy to counter that as well. A strong strawberry jam, as well as the stone fruits also in a jammy sense present yet again. Day 32, final notes we have. Coffee has a lot of similar attributes to the previous day, as it's been pretty consistent since the adjustments. Some additional things we're experiencing is a well-defined red berry aspect to complement both the peachiness as well as a generic citric component, slightly heavier, smokier chocolate component with a slight heavy, darker florality as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 4s. So let's go through this real quick. And we'll start with the finish, level 4. Yes, and with all of the things we've said, especially about this coffee being a little heavy, it's really nice that that does finish on the level 4. I do have to say that this probably has the most long-lasting finish of the 3 coffees that we're discussing from Monogram. Even then, it did verge on that overbearing sense, but it did not reach that level. It did have a finish that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of, as it offered a lot of things, most specifically that heavier red berry aspect, a little bit more of a heavier chocolate aspect, as well as a bit of smokiness too, so not necessarily things I'm looking for in the finish. In addition to that, the sweetness reached that level 4 mark, and I really have to think whether or not this coffee or that washed Colombian coffee was the sweetest of the 2. I think I want to give it to that Colombian coffee because this one right here seemed to skew a lot in terms of that red berry sweetness, which isn't necessarily the type of sweetness that I do enjoy, whereas that Colombian coffee did have a little bit more of a better defined fruit sweetness to it for me. So this one right here, I would say maybe on the slightly higher side of the level 4, but once again, it's not necessarily in the direction I was hoping for. Berry fruit, level 4. Yes, and it's kind of funny to think about it because I feel like if we would have been making these tasting wheels 5, 6, 7 years ago, this probably does score the level 5 in terms of the berry note on here, as the very strong sort of strawberry aspect that was present within this one from start to finish back in the day would have been one of those that it was defined enough to justify that level 5, as well as being long lasting and strong pronounced enough to reach that level 5 mark. But given that we've reached a point in coffee where those natural processed Colombian coffees, as well as a lot of anaerobic coffees in general, are the ones that have really skewed this tasting wheel in general very far along that level 5 side of things, this one, as a result, only reaches that level 4 mark, though it is a very strong and heavy berry component within this one. We have quite a few level 3s. We'll start with the body, level 3. As I kind of mentioned, I was making these tasting wheels alongside each other, and it was interesting to me that this one did score that level 3 because it does indicate that it had a little bit more body to it than the the wash processed Panamanian coffee, the Bambito that we reviewed. That one, once again, I keep going back to it because the body was so much lighter than I might have expected, but yes, level 3 for this one, a little bit more medium bodied in general. Cleanliness, level 3. Yes, and I know that might be slightly generous, though there were times with this coffee that there was enough definition within it to justify that level 3 mark. I think that's what I'm going to go back to is, by natural standards, this is probably middle of the pack. It's probably average. It's not necessarily above average in terms of the cleanliness, but I think the strawberry was so well pronounced at times and so well defined that it did justify reaching that level 3 mark. So I'm fine with it being there. Could be considered a little generous by some, but I think it probably did earn it for that reason alone. Acidity, level 3. Yes, not necessarily the brightest coffee, and as I'm kind of thinking back on it, given that I was making these tasting wheels side by side, I'm looking back and remembering that that Colombian coffee did reach that level 4, so I guess that was the brightest of these coffees, but I probably expected all 3 of them to maybe reach that level 3 mark, so this is in line with the expectations. Florality, level 3. It's one of the final notes I mentioned while discussing this coffee, and once again is that heavier, dark floral components to it. A lot of people might list that as something like a lavender. I could see that it did have a little bit of that heavier, kind of darker berry components to it. So while I focus and emphasize the strawberry attribute, you could also see some maybe heavier blueberry components to it as well. Citrus fruit, level 3, yes. And what's been really tricky about these coffees is I haven't necessarily loved the definition to citrus in any of the 3 of them because they've all scored at least a fair bit of the citric quality in them, but this one once again didn't necessarily have it in a very well-defined manner to it. I've been alluded to the fact that it was a generic citric component for me. Stone fruit, level 3, yes, I do think if I wanted to be very nice, I could say that this is maybe a little bit more jammy of a peach quality to it, but oftentimes I like to associate that a little bit more closely with an apricot. So the peach for me, I didn't necessarily feel it a lot. If anything, it's a little bit more of a peach brightness as opposed to a very well-defined fresh fruit, stone fruit sort of component to it. So level 3, I suppose. We continue on to the chocolate level 3. Yes, and that's that kind of natural heavy chocolate component that I experienced from a fair bit of natural processed Ethiopian coffees. So it does score that level 3 mark. And then I think the last thing worth discussing in this tasting wheel is the smokiness, which also did reach that level 3. Once again, as I've kind of highlighted, a lot of these coffees from Monogram we've had have been on the more developed side of things, which wasn't counter to the expectations I'd had going into these coffees. I kind of knew that a lot of these, we want to say maybe more traditional Canadian coffee roasters, ones that have been doing this for a while. Motorcycle again. Ones that have been doing this for a while, they do tend to have a lot of those kind of more smoky qualities to them. This one also seemed to have it, which also is in line with the other coffees that we had from Monogram. So the coffees in general were pretty consistent along the expectations. But yeah, as I'm kind of looking at this tasting wheel, I do think that it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I don't think it'll come as a big surprise that this one was my least favorite of the three. And I've noticed that I become more and more picky when it comes to natural processed coffees. I felt like at some point I might have become a little bit more laid back with them and just kind of expected them to be this way. But it's a lot of the issue with ordering natural processed coffees, especially when they're suggested to me heavier processed coffees. And I just feel like I'm liking them less and less the more of them I have. When there's one that truly stands out, it is obviously because of the cleanliness and the definition. And there are some positives to this one right here. It did have nice definition in terms of that berry aspect, but outside of that, there isn't too much that I did enjoy from this coffee. I mean, it continues to offer a little bit more heaviness. It continues to offer a little bit more fermentiness. It continues to skew in a slightly more overbearing sense, even if this one wasn't maybe to the same extent as a lot of the more overbearing coffees that we have reviewed over the years. So that's to basically say this one wasn't necessarily my preference, though maybe I'm downplaying the overall experience I had from Monogram, because the other two coffees I had from them, there were a lot of positives I took away from them. This one right here, just it's kind of in line with what I experienced from most coffee roasters. When I'm trying them for the first time, it's rare that I actually do enjoy somebody's natural processed coffee. So it takes a lot for me to enjoy a natural processed coffee. This one wasn't necessarily my preference, though. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I'm going to start with the roast profile of this one because, as I've kind of mentioned, it did have a smoky quality to it. So if you do like your slightly more developed coffees, that's the first place I'm going to start with it. And then after that, I'm going to kind of point you in directions, most specifically that very strong berry aspect to it, but not in the overbearing, too heavy sense. It's a little bit more in line with, I want to say, slightly more old school natural processed coffees, as it does seem to offer those berry components in significant abundance, some great sweetness, as well as a little bit of heaviness, long-lasting components, as well as that heavier chocolate too. So couple all of those things together, and that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Tigest Wako Natural Processed Ethiopia from Monogram Coffee. Thank you for watching.